I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, this is Steve.
Hello, this is Cara.
And we'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Innkeepers podcast. Today we have the opportunity to interview Rob Lloyd, who's the senior pastor of Freedom Community Church in Vancouver, Washington. Cara, tell us a little bit more about Rob and what he does.
Yes, we are privileged to have Rob Lloyd. He is the founder and the CEO of Responders Resource Center. He's a senior chaplain and, as Steve said, also a lead pastor. And he has created a great majority of courses on their chaplaincy training program at Responders Resource, and he's a certified instructor of the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation.
Yes.
Also known as ICISF, which you're going to learn more about in our interview today. He holds a certificate in specialized training in schools and children crisis response. He is also a member of the SMART team for public school incidences, and he leads the CISM assist team for private school incidences. In short, he has a lot of experience in working with crisis situations and training people on how to respond to those crisis situations.
Yeah, it looks like in the States he's responded to several crisis incidents, and then he's traveled overseas and worked with mission and other organizations in crisis response. So he has a lot to share with us today, so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for joining us.
Well, we'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of the Innkeepers podcast. And this morning we have the opportunity to have a conversation with Rob Lloyd. Rob, thank you again for making time available for us today.
My pleasure.
And if you could just start by sharing with our listeners a little bit about your background and history. And we're on the topic of crisis conversation. So tell us a little bit about that too.
You bet. My pleasure. So when the Lord did tell me at one point that I was going to be a mission or a pastor, I really thought it would be a missions pastor. So I'd been involved in missions for years and years at my church, couple decades actually, led quite a few different mission trips. And I've been to South America and Africa and the Middle East and different places with crews working in all kinds of mission capacities. And then when I actually got my first job, I was asked to be a care team pastor. And that got me started in the field of realizing that even in our church, which was about 3,000 people, that as a care team leader and a counseling pastor, I just really couldn't do everything that I wanted to do. I felt like I was putting out fires more often than really giving people the kind of care that I wanted to. And so we just realized it was a numbers game and that we needed more people who were qualified to address issues that I would deal with on a regular basis in the church office. And those issues were much deeper than most of the trainings that we saw available. So we started a chaplaincy training program, which was a one-year intensive for people who really wanted to be an extension of pastoral care inside the church. And so we created 21 different courses and a whole program with mentorship and everything else that people could go through. And so now we train a bunch of churches and we train their chaplains to go in and assist the pastoral staff. And that kind of led into law enforcement and fire departments, even military and hospitals, sending us people to train them in trauma response and how to help people. So I currently still run that organization called Responders Resource Center. And I'm a senior pastor of Freedom Community Church. And I'm the clinical director of what we call the Southwest Washington CISM team, which responds to people in crisis. So that's kind of the thumbnail sketch of the background.
Wow. Sounds like there's never a dull moment.
No, not really. It does keep things pretty exciting. But I really enjoy the field work. I've seen a lot of really good things occur. And so it gives the motivation to keep going.
Great. So today we're talking about kind of how to have a crisis conversation with someone. I mean, there's a lot of turmoil around the world. There's a lot of people with turmoil in their own lives, and crises come up and can happen to anyone. So could you help us understand a little bit what a crisis intervention conversation is and what it looks like?
Sure. So the general heading for crisis conversations is psychological first aid. And if you think about psychological needs, obviously there are times when, if I was to equate that to physical needs, I might just need a Band-Aid, or I might need stitches, or I might need surgery. I might need even a specialist, depending on the type of wound that I have. So when we're talking about crisis conversations, we're talking about psychological first aid, which is a little more than a Band-Aid. It certainly helps people figure out what's going on, put some words to maybe indescribable experiences, and helps them process in a productive way in their brain. So psychological first aid, even though the person doing it might not have a deep understanding of mental health, has the backing of people who do and who understand how the trauma brain works compared to the part of the brain that we operate in daily, that we get kicked out of when powerful events happen. And so it helps people get back to that place where they can process events in the way that they normally would, with a part of their brain that they normally operate in, even though they're still going to be uncomfortable, even though things are still going to likely be difficult. It's going to give them a plan and a strategy and the ability to operate the way that they normally would if they had not been in crisis or an event that increased stress to the point where they're not operating like they normally would or should. Is that helpful?
Yeah. So sometimes in the crisis conversations, is it, I would imagine, and I need you to clarify, is it sometimes happening in the moment and then sometimes happening after the event?
Absolutely. So crisis conversations, if I could, I'll kind of outline it like this. When a powerful event happens, if it's really powerful, it's going to take you out of your prefrontal cortex. If you just tap your forehead, that's the area of your brain that you tend to process difficult events or life in. Sorry, not just difficult events, but life in. Right. When it's a really difficult event, that part of the brain shuts down and it moves us into the interior part of the brain we call the limbic system, or the trauma brain.
Okay.
And it does that by flooding the brain with a bunch of chemicals to shut off that front or prefrontal cortex and move us to the limbic system. Now, we might call that psychological shock. And you hear people say, I'm in shock. Well, that's what happens. Or you might hear the terms like fight, flight, or freeze. And those are the things that occur when people are in shock. And you hear people say things like, it took 2 hours, or it felt like, and it took 10 minutes, or vice versa. All these are clues that somebody is in their trauma brain instead of the prefrontal cortex. So to answer your question, I had to put a little background there. When somebody is there because something has just occurred, a crisis conversation is really helpful. It's very best in those first 3 to 10 days or before, from the minute it happens until about 10 days after. Because you want to think of trauma kind of like concrete. When I pour cement, it's wet and malleable and I can move it. I can shape it. But once it dries, it's more like cement. And if I want to do something different with it, I have to jackhammer it up, break it apart, and re-pour it. So there's a desire when somebody's having a powerful event to get to them as soon as possible.
So what kind of situations are appropriate for this kind of a conversation?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I would say, from my experience, that just about anything that is an elevation in stress or an event that you feel yourself or see somebody else responding to. So what might throw me as a trauma chaplain might not throw somebody else who's a trauma chaplain, or what might not throw me as a trauma chaplain might not throw or might really mess up somebody who has not had the kind of experiences with difficult situations that I have. So it could be anything from a divorce to ending somebody's career, either by being fired or just simply retiring, major life changes.
Okay.
It could be all the way from war trauma
Yeah.
and death and sexual assault. And we use psychological first aid in all those situations and have seen really good success in every one of those situations in reducing people's stress and helping them kind of return back to what we call their own cognitive functioning or adaptive functioning, where they can maybe be uncomfortable and not do things as well as they did them before, but they can get back to getting some of their power back and doing the things they need to do to complete the process of recovery.
So let's just on thinking about some of our missionaries that may be listening in and thinking, so imagine a family that's been serving someplace, and we've had more than one family that's been in this situation where they've had to leave suddenly because of a war or a coup or something has disrupted. And maybe one of the children in that family witnessed something, that children shouldn't witness, whatever it was. And then perhaps that's been let go for several years. So where does that conversation come in when someone's like, there's more like the hard and concrete scenario where it's been set for a while and no one's gone back and to investigate it?
Yeah, great. If I can, I'm going to try to unpack that and remember all the components as we go here. First off, I think everybody who's coming out of a mission experience, whether it be a long-term or a short-term, if it be because the time period has just expired or they need to be out of the country for safety or because of conflict arising, I think what we're talking about in psychological first aid, there should be a debriefing that happens as they leave the field.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that debriefing, some of the components or questions that somebody like myself might ask would change depending upon the situation. For example, when we've been into Mexico with mission teams, we'll do what we call a debriefing at the end. We sit everybody down and we kind of walk through a process to make sure that nobody is carrying stuff that they are going to find themselves having difficulty processing on their own without some guidance. And often those can be really fun conversations, and some serious pieces and components in there too. But when you're talking about being expelled from a country where real trauma is taking place, like war refugees or watching people experience loss of loved ones or their livelihood or things of that nature, then I think it's really important that within a period of no more than 10 days, we get a hold of those missionaries and we do process them both individually and as a group. If they're a family or if they're an organization that's working together, we really want to do some group processes with them.
Right.
Because what we can do is we can help get to things before they become entrenched. And that's kind of why I went that route. We want to get to people before things get entrenched. And some good psychological first aid or some debriefing practices, either one-on-one or groups, can really do that. When I do a conversation like that with a group of people or an individual as they come out of those situations, not only am I helping them, I'm assessing them. I'm doing some basic assessment. I'm saying, wow, when we hit these areas, we could see some pretty strong responses. How about we deal with that before it becomes more entrenched? And we can come up with a strategy to give the care. Now, let's say that didn't happen. And parents now are working, Steve, with the child you were talking about. And we're a couple of years in and we see some really strong responses.
Right.
It doesn't mean that child can't get some help.
Right.
That can still happen, but we're no longer with cement or with cement. We're now in concrete.
Right.
And so the common therapies with that, and this is where, some Christians really struggle with using any mental health practices. I struggle with using bad mental health care practices, but not with mental health care practices.
Yeah.
So cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT,
Right.
what they call talk therapy. And the basic component there is called extinction. So you try to figure out a way that somebody is thinking about or processing something that is not helpful to them. It's actually harmful to them. It's causing great duress or distress. And they work on blowing that up, getting rid of it, or jackhammering up the concrete, and then redeveloping a way to look at that. Well, obviously for us in the faith-based community, we believe that theology in advance is really important prior to suffering. So we'll tell chaplains, you need a theology of suffering before you can go in and work with people in suffering. Otherwise, you're not going to have a foundation to work from.
Okay.
But we have some really good Christian counselors who do cognitive behavioral therapy and some other therapies. One that I'm really fond of is called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it helps get the whole brain involved in the trauma, not just the trauma brain, so that we can mitigate people's responses. But when we're dealing with kids, and as long as we're on the subject, I think that's an important one. We have to realize that children process trauma differently than adults do in some ways because of their developmental stages. And as they go through the developmental stages, I think the big piece for us is making sure that the people they're talking to know how to communicate in a way that children can understand, and know how to hear children in the way that they communicate. Because especially those younger kids, it's not usually verbally that they're going to give you information.
Right.
It's through activities. And that's why we use what's called play therapy to work with children.
Yeah.
That's a helpful distinction that, you're kind of painting the picture of this is long-term therapy can look like this, cognitive behavioral therapy, play therapy, these tools. But today we're talking about the tool of having crisis conversations with someone in the first 24 hours to 10 days. And that how maybe even someone who doesn't have all the skills of a counselor can be helpful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I will make a distinction too. When we talk about psychological first aid, especially with groups, because we can do groups or individuals, as I previously mentioned. With groups, I really do want to get there early. But I have had some groups, especially I went to the Middle East not too long ago, and there was a group of Christians who are working with war refugees, not just from Syria, but surprisingly, it seems like every war refugee had kind of come into this area. And we'd realized that many of them have been packing trauma for years and years. The group process still worked with them. We just like it if we can get to it earlier. And individual crisis conversations, although again, best if done before something can become entrenched, can be done decades later, whenever anybody is ready and willing to talk. And that's part of our job, is to help them be ready and willing to talk.
Okay. So can you walk us through what that conversation looks like?
When you're meeting with someone shortly after a trauma experience or a crisis experience. So what kinds of things are you going to talk about?
Yeah. So first of all, I'd say that for each of those crisis conversations, structure matters. So when we deal with trauma or crisis or powerful events, whatever somebody will define their incident as, we're going to start out in what we call the cognitive area. In other words, we're just going to talk about stuff that's not super powerful. It might be planning. It might be, what were you doing before this? I'm glad you came in today. And then we slowly work in what we call an inverse bell curve in every trauma conversation. We start out in the cognitive, and then we allow the questions that we're going to ask and let them respond to intensify in steps, kind of like a submarine starting at the surface of the water and then slowly diving. And then we realize how deep we are going to try to take them, because again, we're not getting into psychotherapy or counseling in deep levels here at this point. And that will be the worst of the worst responses they're having. And then we finish by bringing that sub back up to the surface. We want to bring them back up to a cognitive level so that we're not leaving them in the conversation where they're psychologically bleeding. We've brought them to the worst of the worst and say, okay, our time is up. We want to help them process that and integrate it in with the rest of their brain. Now, that might sound complicated, but it's not complicated really at all. It's just intentional. So we start out with conversations that pieces or questions that aren't so powerful. We intensify them. And then as we come back up, we do some education. We begin to talk to them about how they're feeling at this moment. What do they plan on doing with some of the information they've had? Because now they're having to think, they're having to put it back in their prefrontal cortex, their regular operating system, and they're much more able to then go adaptively into the world and function. So the structure matters. And I say that because a lot of people do want to wing it.
Yeah, okay.
They believe because they care or they've had their own trauma, they might know how to do that. And I would say being intentional is really important about the structure, but it doesn't take a lot of training. A lot of the training we're talking about are 2-day courses.
Okay.
And you can even do those online now in some settings. So if you're somewhere across the world and you say, great, I can't get that training, you really can.
Okay.
So now that we've kind of established that it has to have some structure to it, I'm going to say the first piece is we have to have a conversation in a location and a time where we won't be interrupted or cut off.
Okay.
Because of that inverse bell curve that I just talked with you about, at some point you're going to get to the worst response for them right now, or the worst part right now. And you don't want them to have to leave, to take off, to go to another duty. Somebody knocks on the door and has to ask questions. So finding a place and a time where you can get through the conversation uninterrupted is a really important piece to make sure that we don't do more harm than good.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to ask basic questions like, tell me a little bit about why you're here today, or what's going on with you. And that question obviously is going to morph a little depending on what you know about the situation and what the situation is. But again, it's not asking for the deep, hard, most complicated part right off the bat. It's saying, why don't you give me a little bit of an idea? I understood that you were in this event. I understood this is kind of powerful for you. Can you give me a brief description of what that event is and what your role was in it? Or how did you hear about this? Or when did you come into that, whatever the scenario is?
Uh-huh.
And we're telling them we want it brief, because what we don't want to do is get the bends. And if you know, in diving, or, back to the submarine analogy, you can drop so fast that you kind of blow up. You can't take it.
Uh-huh.
And so we want a very brief description about how they got into the event. Somewhere in there, what we're hoping to do now is come to what we call active listening. We really want to get them to put words now to their indescribable experience. So we ask the question, and it's not our job to just keep talking and to start trying to fix things. That's a complete miss in what we're doing. Or to share with them all the traumas that we've been through and how we've got through them. That's not the role here. The goal is, now that we've asked the question, to get them to talk about it. And as we get them to talk about it, we're going to ask clarifying questions, and we're going to paraphrase, but we're going to keep it brief so we can keep them putting words to their indescribable experience.
Okay.
When we've kind of come to the point where, they've got a chance to talk about that and tell us what they want to tell us without us digging too deep, without us prying up stuff that they don't want to let go of, because that's not our job either. That goes into psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. Then at some point, we're probably going to ask the question, so what's the worst part about this event for you right now? And we'll do the same thing here. We're going to ask some clarifying questions. And I'd say 2 or 3 is kind of the max. You don't want to ask 25 clarifying questions. You're moving into psychotherapy. So about 2 or 3 clarifying questions at the most, maybe some summary paraphrasing, which are things that sound like, or in other words, I think I hear you saying. So those type of statements to clarify, but that open the door for them to keep talking.
Okay.
And that should be at least half of this conversation, is them talking.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we're kind of done with that, now that we've asked, what's the worst part now, the sub has hit the bottom. And now we have to start moving the submarine back up. And this is where we might say something like, so tell me how this is kind of affecting your life right now. Are there changes that you notice in yourself or in your patterns of life? And they might ask, what do you mean by that? And say, well, are you having trouble thinking, sleeping, getting to work, going to the places you went before, finding enjoyment in the things you found enjoyment? And so you ask them to start to talk about that. Now they're cognitively having to process, how is life changing? And so you're moving them up, and they're telling you what kind of impact that they might be having, what kind of response is all this stress given them. And then when they're done, we move to helping them discover some things that might or might not work for them to mitigate the stress. And I call this the teaching area. We teach them that the common responses they're having are normal and healthy, because they usually are. And it takes a little bit of training there to know when they're not. Some people are very sensitive. If people are really crying, or if they're seeing visions or anything, that they believe they're in deep trouble, which isn't necessarily true at all. And so we kind of listen to their responses, and we help them to figure out if their responses are healthy, normal people responses to abnormal events. And then we normalize it for them so they don't believe they're losing their mind, because a lot of people feel like in crisis that they might be having a psychological break, when in fact they're just responding normally to powerful events. And then we help them figure out how to communicate with other people about their trauma, which could include telling other people they don't want to talk about it, depending on who those people are. If they're just out there trying to get information because they're interested, but really aren't going to offer any aid, all the way down to how do you go and tell your family or other people that you're having some responses. I'm having a little difficulty today. I need some help today. Maybe I need some space today. And then what are the things that they're going to do to care for themselves in the process? So we go through the self-care check. Here's things that you can do. And then here's how you can reach me so that we can talk again if you need help. And at the end of that conversation, whoever is the one leading it, then we make an assessment. Are they in a place where they're uncomfortable? Because we haven't fixed anything. What we've done is we've given them some tools, given them some power back, help them process and clarify the event and mitigate some of the stress. But have I put them in a place where, although uncomfortable, they can go and grow on their own? They can encounter conversations with the Lord and maybe return to their own adaptive functioning? Or are they at a point where I say, boy, this seems to be a little bit more than the responses I would expect. Maybe this is time to get some additional help.
Okay. Yeah. And that kind of leads into the next question. And I just really, Rob, just really want to affirm your ability to explain pretty complex things to someone such as myself. I know Cara has had so much training in this area, and she's like clicking and is all firing with, but I'm just a layman. And, but you're doing such a great job of explaining it. Thank you. And I feel like you've obviously taught this a lot and spoken words. But so you talk about someone may need a next step, another step after this. So what are some of the signs or symptoms of that? And where do you refer them? How do you refer them? Do you have a second conversation with them? So what happens?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll tell you is in psychological first aid teams, there was a survey done a couple of years ago about what is the weakest component in psychological crisis response teams. In the organization that I have my training from, there's over 1,800 teams all over the world. And so that's just one of many who teach a different form of psychological first aid. And the number one place of failure was follow-up. And I think that can tell us right off the bat, if you want to be better at this than most, then just make sure that you actually follow up with people. So a follow-up really should occur with psychological first aid, but we're always making an assessment. We're watching their body language as opposed to just listening to their words. You know, people who are clearing their throats continually they're kind of choking on the experience and they don't even know it. Or you watch them and their eyes begin to well, or their knee bounces up and down. And what you realize is their body language is saying, this is really challenging for me in this piece I'm talking about right now. And so we take notes of those things. And when we do a follow-up, we're going to address maybe some of those more specific areas. If I see that it's really intense, maybe even really entrenched in the first conversation, I will probably just go right ahead to refer them. If I realize based on the time frame from when the incident happened that they're having strong events, but they're still kind of in that middle point, and maybe they're not to the point where they need referral yet, but they're close, then I'm going to do a follow-up the very next day. I might do a couple follow-ups in that week, just to watch and see if some of the suggestions and pieces that we've worked on are bringing this event down. And I don't even need them to bring them down a lot. I just need to see that there's some change in adaptive functioning and a reduction in their response to the event. If that's the case, and it is working its way out, then I could choose at that point, depending on how much time I have, and I think that's always a factor, to check up with them once a week for the next month and make sure that we really are there. But if after a month I'm still in the place where I just don't see any significant change happening in the way that they are able to return to what we call adaptive functioning, working in their world, even though uncomfortable, even though not quite as organized or productive as before, then I'm definitely going to refer somebody to help. If I could, I'll give you these 3 pieces I think might be a helpful way to gauge that. Picture a teeter-totter, and in the middle of the teeter-totter is that pivot point. Mm-hmm. We know that when somebody goes through a powerful event, they're going to have distress. Distress is natural to powerful events. It's what healthy people do. They have stress responses or distress. Then we come to this point of the middle of the teeter-totter, and we're going to call it impairment. Impairment is when I can't do things that I did before this powerful event happened, or I can't do them the way that I did them before. And significantly enough that you could note that either personally or as the observer. But then there comes this point called dysfunction. Mm-hmm. Now, dysfunction means I really can't return to adaptive functioning. And sometimes we see dysfunction of, I won't communicate with my family for long periods of time, not just a day or 2. I won't get up and take a shower. Mm-hmm. I won't feed myself. I'm not going to return to my job. Okay. I'm not taking my medications, doing things like that. When we see people in dysfunction, we immediately refer them. When we see them in distress, we imagine that they're probably going to get better if they just do some things to help themselves, some self-care. Impairment is kind of that gray area. We know impairment's going to happen, but when we see impairment in more than 1 or 2 places for more than 1 or 2 or 3 days, that's when we're going to probably do more follow-up and make sure that it's going to slide to the right side, to distress, not to dysfunction. And that will be kind of the gauge for us to determine if we need to get people referred to a higher level of care.
Yeah, I think it's just really wise to be able to recognize where the limits are, and is someone figuring out how to cope. And what you're describing is that, are their coping skills being activated, or are they just in that place of, I can't anymore, and I need support in order to cope.
Yeah, and I think everybody is coping in one way or the other, and it's such an important distinction. I think we train trauma personnel on this a lot, that when you respond, you are going to respond. If I'm having a response to something, if I acknowledge it or not, I'm going to do something with that. For example, let's say that I watch the news and I see some things on the Ukraine war, and I find in a couple hours, I'm really just not nice to people. I'm not even nice to myself. I'm just angry. I'm frustrated. I could go and keep moving on with life and not realize what I'm doing is I'm having a response to the emotional stimuli and the impacts that it's having on people. And I could just attribute it with being in a grumpy mood. So the first thing I have to do is I have to recognize that I'm responding to something. Mm-hmm. Once I recognize that I'm responding to the Ukraine war by, whatever, then I say, how am I responding? And then I realize, gosh, I'm just being grumpy and irritable to everybody, including myself. And then I can come to the third part. I can say, how is it I want to respond? How would I like to do this differently? But I think that threefold process is a regular piece that anybody who's working in difficult situations needs to practice. Am I responding? How am I responding to what I'm responding to? And how would I like to respond? Because if you don't do the first 2, you can't get to the third one. Yeah, and this is where we see people do destructive things instead of productive things. If they can't realize that won't realize that they're responding to something, and then how they're responding tends to be more destructive than productive. This is where people return to really destructive habits or start them, such as drinking, pornography, illicit relationships with other people, kind of self-imploding and pulling back from their faith practices. So we will respond. The question is, will it be productive or destructive? And it really depends on if we're proactive or if we're just going to let the response happen.
Yeah, there's a choice there.
Yeah.
With awareness, we can make a choice. But so often we don't realize we have the tools or don't know what to do, and people are just kind of overcome by the moment and don't. And I feel like that's a lot of what this crisis conversation is bringing awareness to the struggle and giving them really tangible tools to make choices and decisions. How you describe the submarine coming back up, it's like, oh, okay, what do I do next? Now that I realize that I'm in this dark space, what are my choices?
Yeah, I think self-care is one of those things that, again, we can say the term, but unless we help people define the term and define steps to self-care, then they won't do self-care. Mm-hmm. And I think you have to be, just as you said, I thought that was really well said. You have to be intentional. This isn't something that just happens. Usually if it just happens, it's not going to be quite that helpful. Mm-hmm. If we're intentional, it's going to be much more useful to us. For example, in my office, I have quite a few whiteboards. I'm kind of a big picture guy. I don't do a lot by collecting things on a computer screen. I have to write them out and map them out. And along the column of my whiteboard, I have a topic that says self-care. And I have 10 items written there. One of the reasons I have it there is because I have to confront that every day. And I say confront it because I'm not great at self-care. I don't actually picture a lot of people being great at self-care. I know my devotional times to the Lord. I know to be with him. I'm in the Word regularly. I'm a teaching pastor. It's what I do. It's a vocation. I love it. I mean, it's the greatest thing I've ever been able to do. So I would say I spend a lot of time in the Word and a lot of time in prayer over those things. But I also know there's some things I need to do, like go take a walk. Go spend 15 minutes, take a walk. I have on my self-care list, go play with my dogs, because they're silly and their life is so simple, and it kind of takes me out of the complexity of my life. When you touch people or animals, you release the bonding hormones, oxytocin, into the brain, and with that come all the good stuff like serotonin and the feel good and happy chemicals that will drop into your brain. And so I have things like that on my list. Go out in nature if I have more time. We know that going out in nature is really key, actually, to a lot of mental health things, getting out of the city and the hustle and the bustle. But I have my self-care list, and it's on a whiteboard because it has to change. Like, I really like hiking when the weather's dry and warm. I don't so much care for that when it's raining. I'm, a fair weather hiker. So I've got to be able to adapt that list to be realistic with myself. Yeah. If it's on the list, but I won't do it, it's not any help at all.
Right.
And so often when I'm dealing with people who are going through powerful things, when we go through that bell curve, the submarine, when we go down and we come back up, as I'm doing the teaching and helping them figure out some things that will care for them, I actually usually hand them a piece of paper that has the numbers 1 through 10 and ask them to spend some time just writing a self-care list, and then to post it somewhere where they're going to see it. Because I know when I'm stressed, I don't make great decisions. I make decisions, but they're just not quite the ones they would be when I'm not stressed. And sometimes I forget the things that I should do for myself. And so instead I'll sit down and eat a dozen cookies, and that's not the response I really need.
No. But it is actually telling you something, isn't it? It's talking to you about stress. So I'm curious, when let's say you've traveled to a location where some missionaries are processing a crisis situation, how many times do you hear from the missionary, I had no idea that other people were feeling it? It's sort of, they're like, I feel like I must be the only one dealing with this. Like, oh, everyone else is probably fine, but wow, I don't know why I'm feeling this way. Do you hear things like that?
Yeah, I do. And I don't just hear it with missionaries. I hear it in all walks of life. Mm-hmm. So many people believe that there's something inherently broken with them if they have a response to a powerful event. Mm-hmm. And it's simply not true. And it really limits the ability to get the kind of productive short-term care that they need. And again, I think that's a big thing about psychological first aid. We're not talking about 6 to 8 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy. We're often talking about 1, maybe 2 crisis conversations. And for a one-on-one, our average length of a conversation is 15 to 20 minutes, unless it's been entrenched and we've been in a war area and I'm having one-on-ones. Those can go an hour and a half because they have so much to unpack. And then some follow-ups, which are usually pretty brief, 15 minutes also. So we're not talking about something super intense. We're not talking about something that is going to be written on their record that they've been going to mental health. And some people find that to be a stigma to go to mental health. I personally don't. I think it's good wisdom. Here's what I'll tell you. When I deal with people who do the trauma work, the ones getting the training, what we realize is that there's a difference between compassion fatigue and burnout. Compassion fatigue is when I've dealt with so many different traumatic events that I'm kind of losing my empathy towards other people. And I had this experience on a suicide call out I'd just been to a couple more and some pretty powerful events. And then I got called to a school where there was a suicide of a student. And I'm working with a bunch of students and staff, and I'd been there all day long. And by the time the late afternoon came, I honestly had trouble thinking about anything other than the cup of coffee and the pastry I was going to get on my ride home. I lost my ability to hear anymore. I got filled up to capacity with as much trauma as I could take, and my empathy went away. Now, that's not uncommon if you just keep exposing yourself to terrible things and don't take care of yourself. And if you then recognize that and take care of yourself, you'll bounce back, but you might need to give yourself a couple days, couple weeks, maybe more to do that if you get to that point. Burnout is when I actually lose that ability in what we call neuroplasticity, in my ability of my brain to handle more people's trauma. And burnout actually creates some real issues in the neurocircuitry in the brain to where I should probably stop doing what I'm doing. I probably am not helpful to people anymore. I just don't have a general sense of empathy or care. I'm going through the motions. I could actually do damage or harm to people. And so as a chaplain, I never want to lose my ability to care for people. It's meaningful. So I take care of myself when compassion fatigue happens because I never want to hit burnout. Here's the problem for some of the missionaries. They go out and they are givers. They love because they've been loved by Jesus. And they want to pour themselves out continually. But even Jesus went to the Father and got filled up again. And he went and he spoke with the Lord and with the Father and just dumped. I mean, we go back to the Garden of Gethsemane. If you want to watch a grief conversation, I mean, this is what happens. The Greek is clear. He goes into the garden and he doesn't just kneel down. It's almost as he throws himself to the ground, is the way it would read. He collapses. He sweats drops of blood. I mean, this is intense, but he's getting counsel from the Lord. Well, the Lord's gifted the church with ministries and, evangelists, prophets, pastors, teachers for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. Why not go back to some of those people that the Lord has gifted the church with to deal with things like trauma, to deal with theology of suffering, to deal with those parts? And is it a problem if the church then actually figures out how grief and trauma works inside of the human brain? I mean, Solomon was the wisest of all men, and God gave him the ability to have amazing conversations with people. So I don't understand the stigma, except for I would say that we've obviously seen some of the church move much more to a secular approach to everything. I don't think that's what this is at all. I think it's just much more intentional conversations with a deep faith-based background, knowing that Jesus has given us the ability to learn and to reason and to be creative and figure out how to help. So I wish missionaries would not see themselves as those who are worthy of injury in order to be of the greatest service of the Lord. I remember coming to that. I had a really broken background before coming to the Lord. And I remember after coming to the Lord saying to him, not too much after that, Lord, I think you should send me to the deepest, darkest place in the world that I could die for you. And I remember the Lord coming back and saying, what if that's not my plan? What if my plan is to make you healthy and whole and happy and to help you to figure out how to just live this life in a way to glorify me? Well, I really struggled with that. And honestly, I think deep down inside, there's a part of a lot who serve in the church in deeper ways that just say, I will suffer, I will bear it all, Jesus bared it all. Jesus bared it all. And I think it's okay to care for self so that we can keep caring for others, to do things that are reasonable and responsible. And yet somehow there are some who just won't make that equation, that in their humanity, there is suffering. And in suffering, it's reasonable to come to other brothers and sisters and get some assistance so that you can go back and that you can walk in the joy of the Lord and help other people.
Sometimes when I'm talking with people and we talk about the necessity of a place like Sanctuary Inn, because people don't always understand why it's important. I use the just kind of play on words where I say missionaries spend their time and their resources and they spend their own money and they spend their own energy and they come to us and they're spent people, having spent everything they were given, and now they come to us spent. And so part of our mission and ministry is trying to equip people so that in these areas of self-care and so on, they can learn how to minister and how to care for others without totally being spent by the time they're done. And so I feel like that's very much what you've been telling.
I would agree with that. I think it's important.
Yeah. So if someone's really, they've listened to this conversation and they're like, wow, I need some more resources. So can you just maybe some books and or websites and or training that we can list in the show notes so that people can pursue this a little further?
Absolutely. I would love to help. So the organization that I am trained to do some teaching through is called the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. But if you type into your search engine ICISF, you will find the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. And they do teaching online, which you can get online trainings. And I don't offer that, even though we could, simply because I have a high value for face-to-face meetings and all the role plays and the question asking. But they do use proctors. And if you're somewhere where you cannot access this type of training stateside, I would encourage you to get some of that training. I think it's very useful. They're not a faith-based organization, but they do a lot of work with faith-based organizations because they realize the majority of chaplains and trauma workers, not even just chaplains, are faith-based individuals. They're the ones who want to get out there and help and do their thing. So I would say that is one good source. If you're here in our area in the state of Washington, we're in Southwest Washington, we have responderscenter.com, and we offer a bunch of training and chaplaincy programs for people who want to use those in missions or in their church, or maybe even in an emergency responders setting. And then there's K-Love Radio, actually. If you're in the area where they do some trainings, they actually do free trainings. And it's the ICISF training with ICISF instructors, but there's somebody who donates the cost to train as many people as they want to train. And so they'll travel around the country, and you can go to K-Love Radio and find some of that information under their ministries, under Crisis Care. Mm-hmm. And you can get a lot of that training for free if you're in that area. So another really good resource. When it comes to books, honestly, a lot of them are probably more secular based, but they're good. Yeah. They can be kind of complicated. One of the best books of understanding trauma is really graphic, and I want to share that information. The gentleman who writes it is certainly not a believer. He's a little foul-mouthed, and so I'll just be straight up front with that. But he deals with very complex issues in pretty graphic detail, including a lot of sexual assault stuff. The book is called The Body Keeps the Score. It is a very good book of understanding trauma, but I do want the readers or listeners to know that this is not a PG book. It's much more complicated.
I slog my way through that right now. It's very slow going for me. So
yeah, and one series that I really recommend that I've enjoyed a lot is June Hunt has a program called Hope for the Heart. Mm-hmm. And she sells these little books that are, they're just tiny little books, but they're on each individual topic that one might come up with. Dysfunctional family, suicide, gambling, depression, and they're really helpful, I think, and they're just bathed in scripture and scriptural examples. So I think I hand out a lot of those books to people who are in certain situations, and there's probably 25 of them, and they're all very topical, but they just have some really good, and not just information, but action plans. Here's what you should do with this. Here's the next place to go with that. So I really enjoyed that series of books too for believers.
Well, thank you. We're just so grateful for the time that you've made in your very busy day. I don't think you ever have time to sleep based on our conversations today, but thank you again for your time, Rob.
Yeah.
Oh, it's been a privilege. Thank you guys for letting me come on the show. And I hope it actually is helpful to someone.
Well, I really believe it is. And I think you've given a great starting point for people that want to pursue this topic and realize how important it is.
Well, thank you.
Well, Cara, how did you enjoy that conversation today?
Yeah, it was really good to have that concrete example of how a crisis conversation can happen and how it can be helpful. And that any of us really, with a little bit of training, can really step in some hard places.
Yeah.
I think that was some good points that he made.
Well, and speaking of concrete, we're not playing on words, but the idea of the fact that an incident can happen, and if you can respond to it fairly quickly, you can probably have some pretty significant results with the person that you're talking with, as opposed to letting it go over time where it can be harder to maybe work on a positive response.
Yeah, I think it just gives some hope that someone who's out there working with people in some really hard situations, they don't have to just be feeling like they're stuck in that and there's nothing that you can do. I just hope that people can take this conversation today, maybe read some of the resources, get some training, and really feel more equipped to step in.
Yeah, and I really did appreciate the fact that he said these are oftentimes very simple conversations, and where they're 20 minutes long. You know, you're not talking about an hour, 2 hours, and like,
it's not therapy.
Right, it's not therapy. It's a conversation. It's helping someone just recognize some of the things they've been through, and then just really appreciate what he said. Just step aside and let the person talk, and then ask the right questions, but just let them do the talking.
Yeah, and I think it's also hugely helpful how he was able to express the need for self-care for us as care providers, and for even the person who's going through the crisis, being able to really have some tangible self-care, and that will go a long ways in us not having that burnout he was talking about.
Right. Well, I hope that this conversation today has been meaningful to you, and if there's some things you want to pursue, please check the show notes for more resources. So thank you again for listening to the Innkeepers podcast.
See you next time.
Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.